In the early months of 1945, as American forces prepared for one of the most brutal battles in the Pacific War, Japanese commanders on Iwo Jima felt confident in their defenses. They had spent months, even years, fortifying the 8-square-mile volcanic island into what they believed was an impregnable fortress. Miles of underground tunnels connected hundreds of pillboxes, bunkers, and artillery positions. Every cave had been reinforced. Every approach had been calculated and covered by interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese were ready for anything the Americans could throw at them. Or so they thought. Among the Japanese soldiers, dug deep into the black volcanic sand and rock, stories circulated about American weaponry. They had heard about the powerful naval guns that could reduce concrete to rubble. They knew about American air superiority and the endless waves of bombers. They respected the firepower of American tanks and artillery. But when intelligence reports began filtering through about a new American weapon, something called a flamethrower tank, many Japanese soldiers simply didn't believe it. The concept seemed too fantastical, too much like something from a nightmare rather than reality. Japanese military doctrine had always emphasized the samurai spirit, the willingness to fight to the last man, the conviction that superior morale and determination could overcome material disadvantages. This philosophy had served them well in the early years of the war, when they swept through Southeast Asia and the Pacific. But by 1945, that same philosophy had become a liability, blinding them to the true nature of modern industrial warfare. When lower-ranking soldiers reported seeing intelligence about American tanks that could shoot fire, their officers often dismissed these reports as American propaganda designed to spread fear. Some thought it was a mistranslation. Others believed it was simply impossible to mount such a weapon on a tank chassis. The reality was far more terrifying than any propaganda could convey. The American military had been developing flamethrower technology throughout the war, constantly improving and adapting it for different tactical situations. The basic concept of the flamethrower wasn't new. Various armies had experimented with flame weapons since World War I, but the Americans had taken the technology to an entirely new level, transforming it from a specialized infantry weapon into a devastating armored system that would change the nature of island warfare forever. The development of the flamethrower tank, officially designated as the M4 Sherman with the POA CWS H5 flame unit, but commonly known as the Ronson or Zippo by American troops, had been driven by hard lessons learned in previous Pacific campaigns. At Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and other bloody island battles, American forces had discovered that standard weapons were often ineffective against fortified Japanese positions. Artillery could blast the entrance to a cave, but the defenders deep inside would survive. Grenades could be thrown back or absorbed by the twisting tunnels. Even direct hits from tank guns sometimes failed to neutralize positions that had been expertly constructed and reinforced. Infantry-carried flamethrowers had proven effective, but they came at a terrible cost. The soldiers who operated them, known as flamethrower operators or simply flame men, were priority targets for Japanese defenders. The bulky fuel tanks on their backs made them easy to spot, and enemy soldiers knew that hitting those tanks would create a catastrophic explosion. Flamethrower operators had one of the highest casualty rates of any specialty in the Marine Corps. Something had to change. The solution was to mount the flamethrower on a tank, combining the weapon's devastating effects with armored protection. The system that emerged was an engineering marvel. The M4 Sherman tank was modified by replacing the main gun with a flame projector, while retaining all other machine guns for close-in defense. Inside the tank, 2 large fuel tanks held napalm, a terrifying mixture of gasoline and a thickening agent that made the fuel stick to whatever it touched and burn at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The system could shoot a stream of flaming napalm up to 200 yards, though effective range was typically around 100 yards. Each tank carried enough fuel for approximately 81-second bursts, though in practice, operators would use longer sustained bursts of 3 to 5 seconds for maximum effect. The crews who operated these weapons underwent specialized training. They had to learn not just how to drive and maintain a tank, but also how to operate the complex flame system, understand fuel management, and master the psychological aspects of wielding such a devastating weapon. Many crew members later reported that the first time they used the flamethrower in combat, they were shocked by its power. The roar of ignition, the blast of heat even from inside the tank, the sight of liquid fire arcing through the air and splashing across a target, it was unlike anything else in warfare. As the American Armada assembled for the invasion of Iwo Jima, 8 of these flamethrower tanks were loaded aboard transport ships. They were assigned to support the Marine divisions that would make the initial assault. The plan was to use them against the extensive fortifications that intelligence had identified covering the island. What the Americans didn't fully understand was just how extensive those fortifications truly were. The Japanese commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had created a defensive masterpiece. Unlike previous Japanese defenders who had focused on stopping the Americans at the beaches, Kuribayashi had constructed a defense in depth. The beaches were covered by fire but not heavily manned. The real killing zones were inland, where attackers would be channeled into carefully prepared fields of fire. Kuribayashi had over 21,000 men under his command, and he had spent months preparing them for the American assault. He knew he couldn't win. He knew reinforcements would never come. His goal was simple: make the Americans pay in blood for every foot of volcanic rock. Kill as many as possible. Delay them as long as possible. His soldiers were prepared to die. They had built positions that connected to the tunnel network, allowing them to disappear when bombardment became too intense, then re-emerge when the Americans advanced. They had camouflaged everything so perfectly that American reconnaissance photos failed to identify most of the defensive positions. They had stockpiled ammunition and supplies to withstand a long siege. What they hadn't prepared for was fire. The morning of February 19, 1945, began with the largest naval bombardment in Pacific War history. Hundreds of ships surrounded the small island, pouring shells onto the black volcanic landscape. American commanders believed nothing could survive such a bombardment. They were wrong. As the first waves of Marines hit the beaches, they quickly discovered that most of the Japanese fortifications had survived intact. The soft volcanic sand had absorbed much of the blast from the shells, and the deep underground positions had been completely protected. Within minutes, the Marines were taking horrific casualties. The black sand made movement difficult. The rising terraces provided perfect defensive positions for the Japanese. Machine gun fire swept the beaches. Mortar runs walked back and forth across the landing zones. It was a nightmare. The plan had been to bring the flamethrower tanks ashore after the initial beachhead was secured. That plan quickly fell apart. The Marines were pinned down, taking casualties at a rate that shocked even veteran commanders. The call went out for armor support immediately. The problem was getting the tanks ashore. The volcanic sand was treacherous. Several regular Sherman tanks bogged down as soon as they drove off their landing craft. But the flamethrower tanks had to get through. Marines were dying, and the entire invasion was at risk of stalling on the beaches. Through sheer determination and some luck, several of the flame tanks made it ashore during the first day. But getting them operational proved challenging. The volcanic sand got into everything, clogging systems and causing mechanical problems. Radio communications were difficult in the chaos of the beach. Tank commanders trying to coordinate with infantry found it nearly impossible to hear or be heard over the roar of battle. And the tanks themselves became immediate targets for Japanese anti-tank weapons. The Japanese didn't yet understand what these particular tanks could do, but they knew American armor had to be stopped. Several flame tanks were disabled by mines or anti-tank fire before they could engage the enemy with their primary weapon. It wasn't until late on the first day that a Japanese position finally experienced the flamethrower tank's full capability. A large concrete pillbox had been holding up the advance of an entire Marine company. The position was situated on a small rise, giving it excellent fields of fire across the approaches. A regular Sherman tank had tried to take it out with its main gun, scoring several hits, but the walls were too thick. Infantry assaults had been driven back with heavy losses. The Marines were stuck. Then one of the flame tanks rumbled forward. The Japanese defenders inside the pillbox had no idea what they were looking at. They could see it was a Sherman tank, instantly recognizable by its distinctive profile, but something was different about the turret. Instead of the normal 75mm gun, there was some kind of nozzle or tube. They opened fire with their anti-tank rifle, scoring several hits but failing to penetrate the armor. The tank continued advancing, getting closer than any armored vehicle had dared come before, well within the minimum range where the pillbox's gun could effectively engage. Inside the pillbox, the Japanese soldiers must have wondered what the Americans were planning. Then the world turned to fire. The tank's commander gave the order. The gunner pressed the ignition and trigger. There was a whoosh and a roar as the flame system ignited. A jet of flaming napalm erupted from the nozzle, a pressurized stream of liquid fire that arced through the air and splashed directly onto the pillbox's firing slit. The napalm, thick and sticky, clung to the concrete and poured through the opening. Inside, the temperature instantly rose to unsurvivable levels. The flames consumed all the oxygen in the confined space. The defenders didn't stand a chance. Within seconds, the pillbox was silent. Marines who had been pinned down for hours stood in shocked silence, then began moving forward. The flamethrower tank had just changed the nature of the battle. Word spread quickly among the Japanese defenders. The Americans had brought a demon weapon. Soldiers who witnessed the flamethrower tanks in action struggled to describe what they were seeing to their comrades deeper in the tunnel network. They talked about tanks that breathed fire like dragons from ancient legends. They described how the flames could reach into positions that seemed completely safe from conventional weapons. They reported that there was no defense against such a weapon, that even the deepest bunkers could be penetrated by the liquid fire that seemed to flow like water, but burned with unstoppable intensity. For soldiers who had been taught that willpower and fighting spirit were the ultimate weapons, the flamethrower tank represented something that couldn't be overcome through determination alone. Japanese officers tried to maintain morale, telling their men that these flame tanks were just another weapon that could be destroyed like any other tank. They issued orders to target them with anti-tank weapons. They instructed their men to hold fast in their positions. But the psychological impact of the flamethrowers was devastating. A soldier could prepare himself mentally to face machine gun fire, artillery bombardment, or even a bayonet charge. These were all known quantities. But watching a stream of fire pour into a position where your friends were stationed, hearing their screams, seeing the smoke pour from every opening, and knowing there was absolutely nothing you could do to help them, that was something else entirely. The flamethrower tanks became priority targets for Japanese defenders, but destroying them proved difficult. They were heavily armored like all Sherman tanks, and they were typically supported by regular gun tanks and infantry. Japanese soldiers with satchel charges or magnetic mines would try to approach under cover of darkness or during lulls in the fighting, but the Marines quickly learned to keep the flame tanks protected. The Japanese tried shooting the fuel tanks, hoping to cause an explosion, but the tanks were designed with this threat in mind. The fuel tanks were armored and positioned inside the hull where they were difficult to hit. Even when a tank was knocked out, it rarely exploded in the dramatic fashion the Japanese hoped for. The napalm mixture was designed to be stable until ignited through the proper system. As the battle for Iwo Jima ground on, day after day of brutal close-quarters combat, the flamethrower tanks proved their worth again and again. They were used to clear bunkers, blast cave entrances, neutralize pillboxes, and most importantly, break the spirit of defenders who thought themselves safe in their underground fortresses. The typical employment pattern involved infantry spotting and marking a target, regular Shermans providing covering fire, and then the flame tank moving in for the kill. The tank would approach as close as possible, often to within 50 yards of the target, position itself so the nozzle was aimed at the entrance or firing slit, and then unleash hell. The effect of napalm in confined spaces was particularly horrific. The burning gel would splash inside a bunker or cave and immediately begin consuming oxygen while radiating intense heat. Defenders had three choices, all bad. They could stay inside and be burned alive or suffocated. They could run out and be shot by waiting Marines. Or they could go deeper into the tunnel system, but the smoke and flames would often follow them, and they would still eventually have to come out or suffocate underground. Many Japanese soldiers chose to die by their own hand rather than face the flames, using grenades to kill themselves when they heard a flamethrower tank approaching. One of the most effective uses of the flame tanks came during the assault on Hill 382, a key Japanese strongpoint in the northern part of the island. The hill was honeycomb, with caves and tunnels, turned into a fortress that the Japanese called the meat grinder, because of how many Marines they expected to kill there. For days, American forces made little progress against the position. Every attack was met with withering fire from positions that seemed to regenerate no matter how much explosive was thrown at them. Marines would fight all day to take a position, only to have Japanese soldiers emerge from hidden tunnel entrances at night and reoccupy it. The solution was a coordinated assault using multiple flamethrower tanks supported by infantry and conventional armor. The tanks would systematically work their way across the hill, shooting fire into every cave opening, every bunker, every suspected position. Behind them, combat engineers would use explosives to seal the entrances, trapping anyone still alive inside or cutting off their ability to re-emerge. It was brutal work, exhausting for the crews who had to maintain concentration for hours while operating in a combat zone, but it was effective. Slowly, methodically, the hill was cleared. The flamethrower tanks had turned an impregnable fortress into a tomb. Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with the flame tanks carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Those who were captured and later interviewed by American intelligence officers all spoke about the fear the weapons inspired. One Japanese officer reported that his men would rather face an American infantry assault than see a flamethrower tank approaching. He said that once his soldiers saw what the flames could do, their willingness to stay in defensive positions dropped dramatically. They knew that concrete and rocks, which could stop bullets and shell fragments, offered no protection against liquid fire that could flow around corners and into every space. The crews of the flamethrower tanks had their own psychological burden to bear. Operating such a weapon took a toll on the men who used it. They could see the results of their work up close in a way that artillery or even regular tank gunners couldn't. After the battle, many flame tank operators required time to process what they had done. Some had nightmares for years afterward. But they also knew they had saved countless Marine lives. Every bunker destroyed by flames was a bunker that didn't need to be assaulted by infantry. Every cave cleared by fire was a position that wouldn't kill more Americans. It was a terrible calculus, but the mathematics of war are always written in blood. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days, far longer than the 3 to 5 days American planners had optimistically predicted. By the time the island was declared secure on March 26, 1945, nearly 7,000 Americans had been killed and more than 19,000 wounded. It was one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only about 200 were captured alive. The rest died in their positions or by their own hand. The flamethrower tanks had operated throughout the entire battle, and their crews became convinced that without these weapons, American casualties would have been even higher. It's impossible to know if that's true, but the effectiveness of the flame tanks was undeniable. After Iwo Jima, the flamethrower tank became a standard part of American amphibious assault plans. More were produced and deployed for the invasion of Okinawa, where they once again proved their worth against fortified Japanese positions. Plans were already in motion to produce hundreds more for the anticipated invasion of the Japanese home islands. American military planners had studied Iwo Jima carefully and concluded that the main islands would be even more heavily fortified. Intelligence estimates suggested that millions of Japanese civilians had been mobilized to dig tunnels and build bunkers across every beach and possible landing site. The invasion would require every weapon in the American arsenal, and flamethrower tanks would be at the forefront. The Japanese military, for their part, had also learned lessons from Iwo Jima. Reports from the few survivors who made it back to Japan confirmed that the American flamethrower tanks were not propaganda, but a real and devastating weapon. Japanese military engineers began working on countermeasures. They experimented with different bunker designs that might resist flame attacks, including systems with multiple chambers separated by blast doors and ventilation systems that could be sealed off. They trained soldiers in new tactics for dealing with flame tanks, emphasizing the need to destroy them at long range before they could get close enough to use their weapons. They developed new anti-tank weapons specifically designed to penetrate Sherman armor, but in their hearts, Japanese commanders knew that these measures would only slow the inevitable. The combination of American industrial might, technological innovation, and willingness to develop and employ new weapons meant that traditional defensive tactics were becoming obsolete. One aspect of the flamethrower tank that particularly impressed military observers was how quickly American forces had identified a tactical need and fielded a solution. The basic concept of the flamethrower tank wasn't revolutionary. The Germans and Soviets had both experimented with similar weapons earlier in the war, but the Americans had refined the design, produced it in quantity, and deployed it where and when it was needed most. This demonstrated the fundamental advantage that American forces had developed by mid-war: the ability to outproduce, out-innovate, and out-adapt their enemies. Japanese industry simply couldn't match this pace of development. They were fighting 1945's battles with 1942's equipment and 1941's tactics. The psychological warfare aspect of the flamethrower tanks also shouldn't be underestimated. Modern military theorists understand that breaking an enemy's will to fight is often more important than destroying their physical capability to fight. The flamethrower tank excelled at this. Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima, who had been prepared to die for their emperor in conventional combat, found their resolve tested in new ways when faced with this weapon. It's one thing to accept death from a bullet or shell fragment. It's quite another to face death by fire in a confined space with no escape. The fear this created rippled through the Japanese defensive network, eroding morale and making subsequent American attacks more effective. American Marine infantry, by contrast, came to view the flamethrower tanks almost with affection, despite their gruesome nature. To a Marine pinned down by machine gun fire from a bunker, the sight of a flame tank rumbling forward was cause for relief and hope. They gave the tanks nicknames. They painted shark mouths on the hulls. They made sure the tank crews got extra rations and respect. The tank crews, in turn, took pride in their role. They knew they were operating one of the most effective weapons in the Pacific theater. They knew every time they successfully neutralized a position, they were saving Marine lives. This created a strong bond between the flame tank crews and the infantry they supported, a mutual respect born of shared combat experience. The technical evolution of the flamethrower tank continued even after Iwo Jima. Engineers worked on improving the range and accuracy of the flame projector. They experimented with different napalm mixtures to find the optimal balance between burning temperature, sticking ability, and fuel efficiency. They modified the armor protection on the tanks after studying which areas took the most hits in combat. They improved the flame ignition system to make it more reliable under combat conditions. Each improvement was based on after-action reports from actual combat, a clear example of how American forces used feedback from the battlefield to continuously improve their weapon systems. One interesting side note is how the flamethrower tank influenced post-war American military doctrine. The weapon had proven so effective in the specific conditions of Pacific Island warfare that military planners began considering how similar concepts might be applied to other scenarios. This thinking contributed to the development of various flame weapons and thermobaric devices in later conflicts. The basic lesson of Iwo Jima, that some tactical problems require specialized weapons that combine mobility, protection, and overwhelming firepower, remained relevant long after World War II ended. For the Japanese military and government, Iwo Jima represented a turning point in their understanding of how the war would end. The battle demonstrated conclusively that American forces could take even the most heavily fortified positions. The Japanese defensive tactics had no answer to American material superiority, and that new weapons like the flamethrower tank made traditional bunker defenses obsolete. Some Japanese leaders began seriously considering surrender after Iwo Jima, though it would take the atomic bombs and Soviet invasion of Manchuria to finally force the issue. The flamethrower tanks of Iwo Jima, while not decisive in ending the war, contributed to a growing recognition that continued resistance was futile. In the years after the war, veterans from both sides shared their experiences. Japanese survivors of Iwo Jima consistently mentioned the flamethrower tanks when asked about their most vivid memories of the battle. American flame tank crewmen struggled with how to talk about what they had done, often downplaying their role or changing the subject when asked about the war. The weapon had been effective, perhaps too effective, and using it had taken a psychological toll that many crews carried for decades. Modern military psychologists recognize this as a form of moral injury, distinct from but related to post-traumatic stress disorder. The men who operated the flamethrower tanks had done their duty, saved American lives, had done this and and helped win a crucial battle, but they had done so in a way that violated deep human taboos about the use of fire as a weapon. The technical specifications of the M4 Flamethrower tank make clear why it was so effective. The main flame gun could fire a stream of napalm that traveled at roughly 100 feet per second. The napalm mixture had been carefully engineered to stick to surfaces and burn at approximately 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for up to 10 minutes depending on conditions. The fuel capacity allowed for approximately 81-second bursts, but in practice, crews used longer bursts of 3 to 5 seconds for maximum effect against hardened targets. The tank retained its machine guns for self-defense and suppressive fire, making it much more versatile than earlier flamethrower vehicles that had been defenseless once their fuel was expended. The armor protection was identical to standard Sherman tanks, enough to stop small arms fire and shell fragments, though vulnerable to dedicated anti-tank weapons. Operating the flame tank required a 5-man crew, the same as a regular Sherman. The commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver all had specific roles. The gunner operated the flame projector, carefully aiming and controlling the flow of napalm. This required skill and practice because the arc of the flame stream changed with range and wind conditions. The loader maintained the pressure systems and monitored fuel levels, crucial tasks because running out of fuel or losing pressure at the wrong moment could be fatal. The commander had to coordinate with supporting infantry and other tanks while making split-second decisions about target priority and positioning. The driver had to maneuver the 30-ton tank across difficult terrain while often under fire, getting close enough for the flame gun to be effective, but not so close that the tank became an easy target. The assistant driver operated the hull machine gun and helped with navigation. It was demanding work that required constant training and perfect coordination. The maintenance requirements for the flame tanks were significant. The fuel system had to be carefully cleaned after each operation to prevent residue buildup that could cause clogs or fires. The ignition system required regular checks and calibration. The pumps that pressurized the napalm had to be inspected and maintained. Regular Sherman tank maintenance procedures still applied for the engine, transmission, tracks, and other mechanical systems. Tank crews often worked late into the night performing maintenance, knowing that a mechanical failure in combat could cost lives. The harsh environment of Iwo Jima, with its volcanic sand and ash, made maintenance even more challenging. Sand got into everything, requiring constant cleaning and lubrication. The logistics of supplying flame tanks in combat also presented challenges. Each tank required regular refueling with the special napalm mixture, which had to be transported carefully because it was highly flammable even before being ignited in the weapon system. Spare parts had to be available for the unique flame components. Additional training materials and technical manuals had to be distributed to units. All of this had to be coordinated through the same supply chain that was delivering millions of tons of ammunition, food, fuel, and other supplies to forces fighting across the Pacific. The American military's ability to handle these logistics, to keep specialized weapons like the flame tanks operational in combat zones thousands of miles from home, demonstrated the organizational and industrial advantages that ultimately won the war. Looking back at the Battle of Iwo Jima from the perspective of military history, the flamethrower tank stands out as an example of effective weapons development and deployment. The weapon filled a specific tactical need, clearing fortified positions that were difficult or impossible to neutralize with conventional weapons. It was produced in sufficient quantity to make a real difference in combat. It was deployed with proper training and support systems, and it was used in a tactical framework that maximized its effectiveness while minimizing its vulnerabilities. Not all weapons development programs succeed so completely. Many weapons look good on paper, but fail in combat. The flamethrower tank succeeded because it was designed by people who understood the actual conditions of Pacific Island warfare and was operated by well-trained crews who understood their weapon and their mission. The Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima who first encountered the flamethrower tanks couldn't believe such a weapon was real because it seemed too terrible to exist. But modern warfare has always pushed the boundaries of what humans are willing to do to each other in combat. The flamethrower tank was just one more step in a long history of weapons development, driven by the need to overcome enemy defenses and achieve military objectives. The fact that it used fire rather than explosives made it seem more horrific, more primitive somehow, despite being a sophisticated piece of military technology. But to the Marines fighting their way across Iwo Jima's volcanic slopes, the flame tanks were a crucial tool that helped them survive and complete their mission. War is never clean or simple, and the weapons used in war reflect that harsh reality. The legacy of the flamethrower tank extends beyond World War II. The weapon influenced development of later systems and contributed to ongoing debates about the ethics and effectiveness of flame weapons in modern warfare. International agreements eventually limited the use of flamethrowers and napalm, reflecting a broader consensus that fire weapons, while effective, crossed certain lines of acceptable conduct in war. But in 1945, on Iwo Jima, those debates were far in the future. What mattered then was taking the island at minimum cost in American lives, and the flamethrower tank helped achieve that objective. Whether that justifies the weapon's use is a question that historians and ethicists continue to debate, with no easy answers. For the men who were there, both American and Japanese, the flamethrower tanks of Iwo Jima remained a powerful memory. American veterans spoke of them with a mixture of respect and unease, acknowledging their effectiveness while wrestling with the nature of the weapon. Japanese survivors spoke of them with lingering fear and awe, remembering how these tanks had breached defenses they thought impregnable and forced them to confront their own mortality in the most terrifying way possible. Those memories, passed down through families and recorded in oral histories, ensure that the flamethrower tanks of Iwo Jima will not be forgotten, remaining a testament to both American ingenuity and the terrible necessities of modern industrial warfare. The battle lasted 36 days. The memories lasted a lifetime. And the lessons learned there continue to influence military thinking to this day.